Everyone. Welcome to the Neuroscience and Education webinar series on building students' cognitive capacity and emotional intelligence. Before we get started, I want to give you a couple things that are going on. We are recording this session, so if you have colleagues that you think want to watch this, you will be getting an email with that information as soon as the recording is ready. If you are calling in rather than listening to it through the audio broadcast, you are being placed on mute as you enter the room. If you have a question during the session, I will be monitoring the session while Ms. Hill is talking. You can type in your questions in either the chat window or in the Q&A window to the right of your screen. That will allow you to be able to ask your questions. So, now what I'm going to do is I am going to unmute our presenter and we'll get started. As soon as I remember how to do that. Here we go. Welcome, Betsy.
Thanks so much. Welcome, everybody. I'm Betsy Hill. I'm President and Chief Operating Officer of Learning Enhancement, BrainWare Safari, and I'm very delighted to be able to share some of the things that are getting us all excited these days this afternoon. I do want to add to Sarah's comments that we are happy to share the PowerPoint slides that I will be using this afternoon, and everybody who's attending today will receive a copy of those. So you don't have to write down madly to capture everything that's on a slide. You'll be able to access those later. So what we're going to be talking about this afternoon is the relationship between cognitive skills and emotions. And we'll be exploring how we can help our students build their cognitive capacity, not just for academic success, which we know is critical in their ability to be very successful academically, but also how to be more effective in managing emotions and social interactions. And I think that the whole connection between emotions in the classroom is becoming a topic of a great deal of interest these days. First of all, I just want to sort of reiterate, those of you who have participated in our webinars before probably already know this, but everything that we do, we approach from the point of view of the brain. And we are constantly asking what neuroscience and the latest research has to tell us about the learning process. And this is really important because our classrooms, just like this image that you're seeing here, are full of unique brains. And when Sarah created this, she didn't create our brains look very similar because they are basically fit inside our skulls and are composed of the same kinds of neurons, but each of them develops independently in interaction with its own environment. And it's important to remember that because we are dealing with a whole bunch of unique brains in the classroom. And of course, not just the student's brain, but the teacher's as well. So starting to think about emotions, last week I started a discussion in a number of LinkedIn groups with a question. And the question was, what role do emotions play in learning? And it was very interesting to me to see how people responded. The question really hit a nerve, especially I found with those who deal with students with learning disabilities, who are very sensitive to the kinds of emotional upheaval and stress that their students are dealing with. And we may not even need neuroscience to tell us this because we know that instinctively and from our experiences, but we also know from neuroscience that emotions are very, very important in the learning process. On the negative side, learning situations can be very threatening for some students. There's always the, oh my God, please don't call on me, will I look stupid? And that whole dynamic sets up the fight or flight response and really shuts down our cognitive processing. So teachers can do a number of different kinds of things in those situations to avoid putting students on the spot. One way, and I actually did this in a session in my office yesterday, and it seemed to work very well there too, is have them discuss in pairs or in small groups and then survey the groups. And there's a little more safety in numbers. So that's just one little example of ways that teachers can help their classrooms be, of course, we need them to be physically safe, but also psychologically safe. The other side of emotions in learning is that they can be a really important part of stronger encoding of information. we definitely don't want just a bunch of passive, uninvolved students. We really want a learning environment that is highly engaging, not to the level of stress, but something that really is getting them actively involved. There's nothing that I would like better than to really have all of my students on the edge of their seats with an adrenaline rush, anxious to know what's going on, because that kind of emotion really attaches to the information we want them to remember, and it makes it a stronger representation of that memory in our brains, and it's then, of course, easier to retrieve when you need it. So getting students emotionally motivated, interested, engaged does help in the learning process. So I just thought I would do a very small, very simple example. Sometimes in education, we ask our students to learn a definition, and then we give them a bunch of facts and tell them the information will be on the next test, or we have them read it. So in this case, we learned that the domestic cat is a small, furry animal, carnivorous, and wild cats, and we have some examples of the big wild cats who are tigers and lions and jaguars and leopards. And then we draw the analogy between them to say what they have in common. What makes them all cats is their structure and their behavior, and all cats are carnivores and predators. So we can just give you that information, which is, okay, now I have it, and maybe I'll remember it, maybe I won't. But if we can present it to them and involve students actively in the process and provide information in a variety of different modes, it's going to be a stronger memory, and it's going to be a lot easier to retrieve later. So if pictures tell 1,000 words, then we're going to have quite a few thousand words here coming up. So we have this lovely little kitty cat who is just so adorable and gets our emotions involved. And that's, of course, our little typical house cat. And then we might ask our students to go and research and find a picture of tigers and lions and jaguars and leopards. And they will start to see this and start to see that there's some real similarity, of course, among these cats. As I said, this is a pretty simple example. And Sarah's probably doing this, and my internet connection is maybe a little bit slow. But pretty soon we'll have pictures of 4 different big cats up there. And then what we can say is, how do we really get them involved in this whole concept of the behavior as well as the appearance being the same? And here are a couple of pictures of the house cat as a predator attacking a mouse, and of course then the big cat as a predator, which is a pretty striking image. So that's an example of how a small example of how we might involve emotions and get them interested and involved in interacting with the information. So teachers have to take care of the emotional side of things in the classroom, a safe environment, a stimulating environment, and one of the things I always like to remember and to share with anybody who's in a situation where we want people to learn things is if the teacher does all the interacting with the material or all the talking, the teacher is the only one whose brain is growing new connections and the only one really learning. So we want to make sure that they have a chance to do that. But then, so the teacher definitely has a very important role in this, but our students, of course, are not always going to have teachers or parents around them to help them manage the emotional environment. And what can we do to help students develop their own abilities to deal with emotions? And in particular, what is it that neuroscience can tell us about this? We want our students, of course, to become their own safeguards of their emotions, and to also be able to use their emotions effectively, because as we saw, emotions have a positive side in learning as well as potentially a negative side. So there's been a lot of work going on recently in the field of social and emotional intelligence, and this is a model that was developed by Salve and Mayer, which looks at EQ in three stages. So the first stage of successful management of emotions is being able to identify emotions in ourselves and in others. This is a skill that everybody isn't equally good at, and it actually takes some practice. for a lot of people. I remember when my 3 sons were growing up, I would ask them in the morning or when they got home from school, how are you? And the invariable answer was, okay. And for a while, I thought that meant they were okay, but it didn't. And I eventually learned to interpret that more accurately. What they were saying was, I don't know. I don't feel particularly bad. I don't feel particularly good, but I really haven't examined my emotions. I really don't know how I am. And so I learned that having to help them clue into their emotions and think about what happened during the day and think about how they reacted to it was a key part of that. And it's really important because if we're going to correctly interpret the moods or states of mind of other people, if we're going to be able to put ourselves in their situation and be able to feel empathy, we first have to have the tools. We have to really be able to describe those and identify those emotions ourselves. And the second stage is once we can recognize those things is the extent to which we can regulate them. And we're going to talk quite a little bit about this, but for now I just want to sort of have us consider an example. And this is both regulating our own emotions and regulating others' emotions. And some of you may be tempted to say, wait a minute, I don't know if I feel really comfortable with saying I'm going to regulate somebody else's emotions. It sounds a little bit manipulative, but in fact, we've just said that part of the teacher's responsibility is to manage the emotional environment. So we do have a role in helping others identify and manage their emotions, and sometimes it is a very helpful social skill to have to be able to refocus what's going on. I think of a story that Sarah tells every once in a while about a teacher who's in a classroom, and she has a little boy named Teddy who is always a problem. And this particular morning as she comes into class, she just thinks, oh, I'm just, I had a flat tire on my way to work, and I'm really stressed, and I didn't finish grading my assignments, and so she's not in a very good mood, and she says, I just know Teddy is going to be a problem today, or I hope he's not going to be. And she comes in, and of course, Teddy does what Teddy does to trigger her irritation. And this particular morning, what she realized she needed to do was to change the dynamic. And she said, all right, I want to stop a minute. Teddy, tell me a joke. And so Teddy was a little puzzled, but he managed to dredge up some silly joke, and he told it, and she laughed, and some of the other students laughed. And she explained to them that that's what she was doing, that she said, I was feeling not myself today, and I felt we needed to change it. So from now on, if you're feeling bad and you're feeling like you're not ready to learn, I want you to say, stop and let's tell a joke. And it became a class routine when somebody really was struggling with those negative emotions and needed to help overcome them, they would share in a class laughter, and it became something that was well understood by the class and a tool that those students then had to use on their own whenever they needed it. And then the third stage is really being able to utilize these emotions as tools with some potentially very important outcomes. Things like being able to be flexible in our planning and more creative in our thinking. And I don't know that we always associate these with our emotions, but in fact, emotions can play a really important role in all of these kinds of activities, redirecting our attention, setting our priorities, being motivated. So let's take just a little deeper look at some of these ways that we want to be able to effectively use our emotions. So one of the things is that the research tells us is that emotional swings can be really help us generate options and alternatives for our future plans. So if something happens that's sort of negative, like the restaurant that we want to go to is closed, or there's a for sale sign that goes up in the house next door or something, or I didn't get the raise I wanted at work, sometimes what happens then is it gives us the opportunity to say to ourselves, okay, this is bad, or maybe it could be good, and to really consider alternative situations, alternatives to our current, if we recognize that we're doing that, and we can think of a different way of coming at the problem. When it comes to creativity, the research suggests that we find it easier to categorize features of a problem as being related or unrelated when we experience a positive mood. And that has been related to creative problem solving. So if we can skip ahead to the next slide just for a moment, this is something called Duncker's candle puzzle. And what has been shown in research is that a positive mood actually facilitates the ability to solve this puzzle. So here's the puzzle. What you have is a book of matches, a box of thumbtacks, and a candle. And your task is to figure out how to fix a lit candle on the wall or on a corkboard or whatever the wall contains in a way so that the candle wax won't drip onto the table below. And so these are the only tools you have. You have nothing else, and you have to figure out how, using these items, to get the candle so that it lit, so that it won't drip onto the table below. So everybody could just take a minute, and if you find your chat box, you might suggest if you think you have an answer and what that solution to the puzzle may be. And if you're in a good mood, maybe you get the answer quickly. In general, that's what would happen here. And if you're not in such a good mood or feeling more stress, then it may take you longer and you may not come up with the answer or may not come up with as good a solution as might have been available. So how are our puzzle solvers doing, Sarah?
Well, we have one in, and that one matches what I was going to do, so that's good.
Okay. All right. Well, we will reveal it as people are still thinking about it and puzzling through it. And what happens is, what you have to do here is you have to think about the box of thumbtacks, not as a box of thumbtacks as one thing, but as something that you can separate out. And if you light the candle with the book of matches and you affix the thumbtack, the little box without the thumbtacks in it, to the wall with a thumbtack, and place the candle on top of that. I think if you forward that slide, I think there's the answer.
You think there's an answer there? Oh, there it is.
Yeah, good. So now you see how that could be accomplished. So
I was right.
So whenever you, that doesn't surprise me. You're very logical, and it sounds like the attendees today and participants are also that way. So when we're thinking about, we really are, especially now that we're starting to work and figure out how to implement Common Core standards and those kinds of things, we really are trying to help our students figure out how to solve problems, how to apply the information that we're talking about. And so being able to establish a good mood and a positive outlook will actually facilitate that, and helping them understand that can be play a role as well. So, I'm going to go back now to the emotional intelligence slide. Thank you for reminding me. Emotions, another way that emotions, we can use them is to interrupt us, to tell us that there's something that we need to really focus on. So anxiety about a test, if we direct it to studying, or if we have somebody close to us who has a real health problem, and focusing on that as opposed to the relatively trivial issues we may be facing at work. So being attuned to our emotions can help us prioritize and can help us really think about the things that we need to be doing. And finally, emotions and moods can be used to motivate and assist performance at complex tasks. When I read about this part of the research, what it reminded me of, funnily enough, is the part of Harry Potter in one of the later books where I think it's Professor Slughorn gives Harry something called Felix Felicis, which is called liquid luck. And it's a potion that makes the drinker lucky for a period of time. And whatever they do is going to be successful. And, of course, you're not supposed to be taking it when you're taking a test and all kinds of other things, because that would be cheating or playing a sports game like Quidditch. But the way that it works in the movie, in the book, is that when Harry's friend Ron thinks he has taken Felix Felicis, he performs brilliantly at Quidditch and doesn't realize, because he believed that he would be successful. And so recognizing that we really can use those moods and our positive emotions to motivate and assist our performance can be sort of in a metacognitive way can be very, very helpful. So let's take a look at intelligence again. And what I wanted to do now was there are about a million definitions of intelligence, and when we talk about utilizing emotional intelligence, of course, that says that we have it. So trying to understand what that is important. So this is a definition that I think is particularly helpful because it focuses on the learning process. It focuses on our understanding of what's going on to enhance the learning process. And it also focuses on context, on the social and cultural context in which we are operating. So it's not just about solving the problem in some kind of technical way. It's really putting all of these pieces together and recognizing the social dynamics of a situation and being sensitive to those and allowing us to learn from those situations and operate effectively in those situations based on our own actions. So this really raises the question of what's happening in our brains when we try to apply these metacognitive processes and to manage our emotions. So we'll just do a tiny little bit of brain anatomy at a pretty simplistic level. But what we're looking at here are the two main brain systems that are involved in what we've been talking about so far. The frontal lobe of our brain, which is also called the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex, of course, is the part of the brain that makes decisions when we think consciously about information. It has a regulatory control role. Sometimes we like to talk about the stop and think center of our brains. And it helps us activate or modulate information from other parts of the brains, including the part of the brain that is underneath it and that regulates other brain activities. And underneath that resides the emotional systems of our brain, also referred to as the limbic system. So what is happening on here is the areas of the brain, for example, that represent our reward center, the areas of the brain where dopamine, which is the chemical that makes us feel good, is generated and transmitted across and up to other parts of our brain. And it's the connection between these two is really what helps with the management, the control, the regulation of emotions and our reactions. And it takes quite a while for these areas to develop. We now know that the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until we're into our mid to late 20s. So that's a process that happens over quite a span of our lives. And those control processes that are executed by the prefrontal cortex are often referred to as executive functions. And this is where we're really going to focus most of the rest of our discussion this afternoon. One of the people that has been doing some really interesting work in this area is Dr. George McCloskey. He's a clinician and as well as a researcher. And in his model, he's done a lot of work with lots of different individuals with executive function disorders. And he presents his model as executive functions operating in 4 domains: perception, cognition, emotion, and action. And so you can imagine taking an executive function like controlling something or modifying something and applying that to our perceptive processes, applying it to our emotional processes, applying it to a cognitive process, and applying it to an action. And each of those, according to McCloskey, is a little bit different. So the functions themselves cross domains, but their effectiveness can be different because the neural connections in those other parts of the brains that are responsible for perception, emotion, cognition, and action are all a little different. So let's take now a look at what some of these executive functions or control functions, self-regulatory functions, if you will, what they are. And it's sometimes when people think about executive functions, they just say, okay, I'm doing it or I'm not doing it. It's sort of on or off. And what McCloskey has shown and described with a lot of different patients in his book is that there are a whole series. In his book, he defines 23. The last time I heard him present this material, he had added several more. I think he was up 30 or 30 plus. So what I did was I highlighted a few here so that we could just sort of focus on a few of them. You can certainly, you'll have the slides, you'll have the whole list, and you might also, when you're looking at his book, find others that you think are particularly relevant for students or patients that you may be working with. But I highlighted a few that I thought would be helpful to talk about in terms of the how they might manifest themselves in a social situation and where emotional intelligence might be suspect or might be implicated if there's an issue going on. So the first one, in the first column that I highlighted here, is focus and select. So if I'm engaged in a conversation with someone and I can't focus and screen out the other things that are going on around me, and a lot of you may connect that with sort of ADD, ADHD behavior, and it's certainly very similar. But if that's the case, then the person I'm talking to is very likely, at best, they may think I'm scattered. But they also may conclude that I'm just not very interested in what they have to say. And that may not be what I intend to convey. It just may be that I'm having trouble screening other things out, but that I do care. So that's a kind of situation where my behavior is going to be interpreted one way and have implications for how I'm going to get along socially in that situation. In the second column, I highlighted inhibition. This is really an obvious control function relevant in social and emotional intelligence. So, for example, we learn over time not to say things like, "Mommy, why does that man have such a big nose?" Or we control our impulse to criticize the boss in front of his peers, or to not smack somebody when we're mad at them. There are all kinds of inhibition things that we do that we learn, and obviously that's controlling the kinds of things that just would not be appropriate and would convey poor social and emotional intelligence. Foreseeing and planning is another really great example, and we do think of foreseeing and planning as being important skills that we develop as we mature. And it's really about making connections between our potential actions and their consequences and figuring out or planning the steps we want to accomplish something. So, for example, if I'm going to go pick up my friend at a certain time so we can go see a movie, there are certain things I need to do in advance. I need to make sure there's gas in the car. I have to make sure that I have money for my ticket. I have to know what time the show starts and a whole bunch of other things. If I don't foresee and plan, that is probably going to lead to a good deal of friction in my interactions with my friend and probably some pretty negative emotions on both sides because I'm just not keeping up with it. And it may not be that I don't care about it. It may not be that I am just cavalier about this. It just may be that I'm not good at foreseeing and planning, and it gets interpreted as being a negative aspect of my social interaction. In the fourth column, time, having a sense of the passage of time is valuable, and sometimes I think it's an underestimated skill. I know we all are familiar with the situations where we're in the car traveling with our kids and the number of times that we get asked, "Are we there yet?" But I'm guessing that we all know people, even when they get older, who have difficulty judging time and pacing their activities, their actions to accomplish what they want. Again, this can, when you're not being effective and you're not really in tune with an internal clock and being able to make those kinds of judgments, you can seem inconsiderate, you can seem pushy, you can seem just emotionally not very appropriately engaging with your environment. And then finally, flexible and shifting. When it comes to emotions, it's really important to know how to shift between emotions. I'm was a full-time working mother for many years. My kids have grown up now, but I remember very consciously of that shift that I went through from my workday to being at home. Feeling frazzled from a day at work is not always the best frame of mind to greet your children or your spouse whom you haven't seen all day. So being able to use those executive control functions to shift from one mood to another is as an example of the way that these functions play a role in our social and interpersonal relationships. So now I want to give everybody, because we know that being able to think about that and process this is an important part of absorbing and really sort of making information your own. In a group setting in person, I would encourage people to think about this, maybe write a couple of sentences about how this might relate to the work that you do with students and the kinds of things you see in your classrooms or your offices or wherever you're doing your work. And then I would have you pair and share. But at this point, I think I want to give people a chance to think about it and to share some thoughts in the chat window. So if you would just take a minute, and I realized, Sarah, we should have a little like Jeopardy music or something here to do 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 do. There you go. Because my voice is going to be irritating and interruptive. But I do want people to have the opportunity to. So a little bit of silence on the tape, on the recording will be okay, right?
Exactly. Not a problem.
And if you'd rather just,
don't worry about spelling.
If you'd rather just write it down to yourself, that's fine. But we'll give people another 30 seconds or so to capture their thoughts.
I can always share mine if no one posts anything.
Well, why don't you share yours, Sarah?
The one that just popped into my head right away is the whole decompressing, as I call it, from work before you get home. And as you know, Betsy, but I work from my home most of the time, and it takes me about a second to get home when I'm off work. And so sometimes having that decompression time can be a little bit difficult, and it's an interesting emotional roller coaster as we try to figure out the ways to do that. We do have a couple of comments. Not all of our students do develop these skills at the same time or at home. And one person says they work with emotionally handicapped students, and one of the most challenging things is to have the teacher give extra time and break projects down in different ways for all the students to be successful.
That is just, and it really goes to the whole factor that teachers, in addition to being stressed and challenged and trying to cover a lot of curriculum, don't always really understand how different those mental processes can be from one student to the next. I think if they were more aware of it, sometimes it would be easier for them to understand that it's not, that's the teacher who says, well, I told them that already, or I told them that 5 times. Well, it may not be that they weren't trying, it's just that it wasn't processing because that's not how that child processes or gets it or needed to understand it. And we'll be talking some more about some of those differences and how, in fact, we can help our students develop some of these skills.
We have one other that says they're applying this to English language learners and thinking about how all of this information, thinking about the role of this information plays for those students.
Yeah.
That's an interesting lens to listen to this from. That's really cool.
Yeah, it is. And as a former foreign language teacher, I can definitely. I wish I'd known some of these things back when I was actively doing that. It would have made a difference. So then, in the next little area, what I want to do is spend a little bit of time looking at some examples of. Sometimes when we're looking at, and this may resonate with some of the people in terms of the issues that they've just described. I didn't put ESL or ELL students here, but sometimes when we're thinking about skills, it's helpful to think about some cases or some situations or some groups of students where these are really issues. And there are 3 areas that I thought I would just highlight because I think they're things that can speak to many of us. which are adolescents, students from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, and ADD and ADHD. So, first of all, in terms of adolescence, the probably one of the most perfect examples or classic example of imperfect emotional control is your average teenager. Adolescents are a real paradox. On the one hand, they have developed a lot of the skills that they need to make mature and thoughtful decisions. And on the other hand, they exhibit extremely poor decision making from time to time. And as parents, we just pray that we'll somehow muddle through and without suffering the consequences that they really can't recover from, while whatever is happening in their brain happens. And indeed, there's some real specific developmental reasons for this paradox. So remember a few minutes ago we talked about the fact that the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system are really critical here. And the fact that we know that the prefrontal cortex doesn't really fully develop into our 20s, and I'm very grateful to say that my kids are now 28 and 30. We see teens really making enormous gains in learning and logical thinking. But the other thing that's happening is that we also see them being prone to some riskier behaviors. And some of us can probably think back to some times when we did some things that we, in retrospect, were just not very smart, that seemed to be reckless or just not very well considered things that we did. And if you ask somebody about that, often what they'll say is, it just seemed okay at the time. So why is it that it seemed like it was okay at the time? And the reason is, there are two pieces of it. One is the immature nature of the prefrontal cortex, which it hasn't fully developed the ability to control and inhibit or tamper or dampen some of the emotional things that are going on. We can be on the next slide, or it may be my internet connection.
No, it was me.
But the other part of the story is our reward system, and what's our reward system? One of factor in that is the creation of dopamine, which is a hormone that makes us feel good, neurotransmitter. And adolescents, it turns out, are hypersensitive to rewards. They show even greater activity during that time of their lives in that area of the brain. And it's also been shown that that part of the brain is associated with risky behavior. So when you're confronted with a situation that prompts the release of more dopamine, then it's going to be, and it's particularly heightened in this age group, it's going to be harder for them to control that. And it turns out that it's not just about seeking rewards. It's also about just the very nature of uncertainty and how we react to that and the role of uncertainty in the learning process. So when you're confronted with a situation that's uncertain, that actually prompts the release of more dopamine than if the situation is certain. So, for example, if I tell you, Sarah, that you have a 100% chance of winning a new car or a 0% chance of winning a new car, there's actually very little activation in the reward center of your brain. But if I tell you that you have a 50% chance of winning a new car, dopamine is released and the level is sustained until that situation resolved. And if you can figure out a way to enhance that and to be able to get that reward and to resolve that situation, that's something that is extremely motivating. So it really makes sense now that if we think about why adolescents in trying to become in the learning process would have some of this kind of activity going on. Well, let's now look at another group of students who are low socioeconomic status students. And this is based on the work of Kimberly Noble and her colleagues, who have found that low SES students have deficits in multiple cognitive systems compared to their more advantaged peers. And this is, of course, not to say that all of them do, but on average, they do have deficits. And as you can see, it's, we've heard a lot about Hart and Risley and vocabulary and how many words kids have heard by the time they're 3 and those sorts of things. But what this work is really verifying is that this impacts system by system, from our visual system to our parietal spatial system to our memory systems to our executive function systems, which is really a lot of what we're focusing on today. So if we think about, now let's think about the impact of some of those. And we can go to the next slide. So if we have cognitive deficits or just not as effective in perceiving patterns and visualizing, we're going to have a lot of trouble, or a lot more trouble, with nonverbal cognition tasks. So organizing our space, understanding nonverbal feedback. These are the kinds of things that I think we often think about when we think about students from these kinds of backgrounds and their ability to cope in an academic situation and in a social situation, is that it's not, there really is a lack of capacity in some ways and of processing that's going on that would enable them really to be effective in these particular areas. Think about being able to control the focus of one's attention, and those are parts of our brains that help us stay on task, to defer gratification, to create a plan. If you have difficulty planning or deferring gratification, when we talked about this example a little bit before, but especially when I think of deferring gratification, the quintessential example of that is the marshmallow test. And I think many of you may be familiar with the marshmallow test. If not, I strongly urge you to Google or check it out on YouTube. And essentially, in this test, young children are offered one marshmallow now, or two if they can wait until a researcher returns back to the room that they're in. And it turns out that their ability to postpone gratification ultimately, to wait for that second marshmallow, was a really good predictor of their SAT scores a number of years later. Working memory refers to how much information we can hold in our minds. And consider this situation, and this may sound familiar to some of you. You have a student who is late to class, and you ask him or her to hang up their coat, get yesterday's corrected homework from the folder, sit down at the desk, and start working on the math problems. Typical situation. Halfway to the coat rack, another student comes into class and gets a different set of instructions. So your student, Johnny, hangs up his coat and goes to take his seat, and you ask him why he isn't working on his math problems. And he looks around as if to say, what math problems? In fact, he has no idea because he skipped the step. He actually didn't go pick up his homework from his folder, and so he doesn't have any math problems to be working on. So this is the kind of thing where often a series of instructions like that are something where there's only so much space in working memory, and they get through part of it and lose the rest. But as a teacher, you may have a lot of different kinds of interpretations of what's going on. You may say, oh, Johnny isn't motivated, Johnny doesn't care, Johnny's ignoring me, Johnny's being difficult, Johnny can't pay attention. But in fact, in this kind of situation, it may be that simply he has limited working memory. And when somebody talked, I think in one of the comments earlier, talked about breaking things down, that may be something that's really important for a student like Johnny. So we can either limit the demands on his working memory, or we can actually help him develop his working memory. And we'll come back and talk about that a little bit more in just a couple minutes. So the last group I wanted to take a look at, and because there's also some very interesting work being done in this area, is individuals with ADD, ADHD. And what we know from the research is that executive functions are frequently impaired in individuals with attention deficit issues. Things like activating, so organizing tasks, estimating time, getting started on a project, focus, effort, sustaining our effort, getting things processed and getting things happening in an appropriate amount of time, emotions, modulating our emotions, managing our frustrations. Working memory is very, very often an issue in individuals with ADD and ADHD. And then finally, moderating and regulating our actions. So those ideas of dampening and inhibition. This information comes from Thomas Brown. He's a clinical professor of psychiatry at Yale University. His book is called Attention Deficit Disorder, The Unfocused Mind in Children and Adults. And I was really struck, I hope you all are too, that this looks a lot like that list of executive functions we saw earlier from George McCloskey. It also looks like the executive functions that we know are deficit areas from those students from low SES backgrounds. And it also starts to look a lot like those issues of self-regulation that we started to talk about as being emotional intelligence. So the important thing here is to really recognize that these are not just about behaviors. These are about neural networks in the brain and how effectively they have been built to cope with and to execute these kinds of processes. So I want to now shift on to how we might think about actually developing and helping our students or ourselves develop our executive functions. So when we start to think about this, I like to ask these questions. Can you explain what you do when you initiate or inhibit or pick another executive function? Can you explain to someone how to hold more information in their mind? Can you instruct somebody or explain to somebody how to sustain or shift their focus? We can sometimes help them. We can cue them. We might just say to somebody, pay attention. We may be able to accommodate them. We may be able to break up the instructions. We may be able to provide some motivation for doing it. But we really can't explain to somebody and have them learn from our explanation how to do these things, because they're processes that happen in fractions of a second, really too short a time for conscious thought. And they are the things that need to be able to happen just automatically, because if we're doing them consciously, again, they're taking up space in our working memory and our active thought processes. But it turns out that they can be trained. And the tool that was used for the training and the results that we're going to share with you is called BrainWare Safari. We don't have time in today's webinar to show you the tool that was used for the research that we're going to share with you, but we're very happy to provide a link and to get you signed up for a webinar that goes in depth on the program. But what we're talking about is a program that comes out of clinical practice with a variety of different disciplines of individuals who help their patients or their students work on these cognitive skills and to repeat them and to practice them over and over until they become automatic. It's in a video game format, has won a number of awards, and really focuses on the kinds of cognitive skills that we've been discussing today, from visual perception to auditory perception to attention, sustained attention, divided attention, flexible attention, and memory skills, especially working memory. So the first study that I want to share with you is from peer-reviewed published research. It was a group of students in grades 1 through 7, and they used the BrainWare Safari program for 12 weeks. We had a control group and a study group, and we used the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive battery to do the pre and the post test. So this is an average of the tests that were used from the Woodcock-Johnson. What you see on the y-axis is the age, the intellectual age of the student. So the Woodcock-Johnson score that you get is an intellectual age. So I might be 8 years old, and I might have the intellectual age of a 5-year-old or the intellectual age of a 10-year-old or 8 or anywhere, and that's what is being shown here. So what you see here is for the students, the individual ID numbers are across the x-axis. You see the results of the pre-test and post-test, and you'll see that these were 3 months apart. Some go up a little bit, some go down a little bit, not a lot of change. In general, what you would expect by giving this kind of cognitive test to students just a few weeks apart without any kind of intervention. The next slide will show us the results from the group that actually used the intervention and experienced the practice 3 to 5 times a week of working on their cognitive skills. And what you see here is that all of the students improve, and with, in general, pretty dramatically, an average improvement, in fact, overall of 4 years and 3 months. over the 3 months of time between these. So these are, I wanted then to also show you, I think the next slide shows the results of some of the specific tests, so that you can see that there's quite a variation in the kinds of improvements you see depending on the skill that's involved. Some of these are more malleable than others. Some of them may depend a little bit on the strengths and weaknesses of the individual students in the study. But wanted you to get a sense for the kinds of impact that it can have on the very executive functions that we've been talking about. So if I look at, for example, I go down the list and see auditory working memory, where the study group improved on average over 3 years, compared actually to an average a little bit of a loss on the control group that didn't use the program. Decision speed and planning, these are two more examples of cognitive skills that were highlighted during our discussion on executive functions. So in fact, these are skills that can actually be changed, and it's we also may need to do some accommodation and some support for students, but helping them develop strengths in these areas can really have a tremendous impact.
Betsy?
Yeah.
We have a question that might be good to interrupt and answer.
Sure.
They would like you to repeat the amount of time that the students in this study used BrainWare as the intervention in the total time.
Right.
In the treatment.
Very excellent. I probably didn't make that clear enough, so I'm happy to say it again. They use the program 3 to 5 times a week for 30 to 60 minutes for 12 weeks. And that's the general recommended protocol. And the time and the frequency are just very, very important, as we've seen in our research. So 3 to 5 times a week, 30 to 60 minutes for about 12 weeks. The next thing I wanted to share with you is another piece of published research that is very, very recent, that has just been published in a dissertation on ProQuest and is about to be published in a Learning Disabilities journal. This involves students, and Sarah, remind me to fix the labels of these slides before we send them out, because people may not be able to interpret them correctly. These were with students with specific learning disabilities who were categorized as that and identified, and were in special education. They happened to be in New York City, and I believe these were 2nd through 4th graders. And what we're looking at here is there was a control group, and there was a study group, and for some reason the study group little legend isn't showing up, but the blue and the green bars are the results from the study group. GIA refers to general intellectual ability, so it's an overall composite of the intellectual Woodcock-Johnson tests that were given. Reading and math were also Woodcock-Johnson. And what we're looking at here is something called the proficiency level. There are a number of different ways that you can look at results from Woodcock-Johnson, but the proficiency level allows us to look at it across different age groups. What the proficiency level means is that a normally developing child is expected to score at 90%. So that a child of any particular age will score at 90%. And then, so what we're seeing here is that these students who we know had specific learning disabilities were significantly behind. They were scoring just above 60% on the pretest. The control group, the group that did not use BrainWare, improved just a little bit, and the study group that did use the program, their average performance, their average proficiency level on the post-test was 89%. So virtually closing the gap from where they were to the expected performance of a normally developing student from a cognitive point of view. And then you can see the improvements in reading and math that were also pretty significant. What I wanted to then show you is the results in this research on some specific ways of breaking out the results of the Woodcock-Johnson. So, for example, on executive functions, you see the study group ending up at an 88% proficiency. Aspects of other kinds of skills that we've been talking about today look at visual and verbal working memory, who are scores actually even exceeding the 90% benchmark. Short-term memory, processing speed, broad attention. So this will give you just a little bit of a sense of the fact that we can, in fact, pretty dramatically help students develop these skills, which are so critically part of their ability to function academically, as well as their ability to demonstrate emotional intelligence and function effectively in social situations. So just a couple more slides, and then we will open things up for any additional questions anybody may have. When we talked about looking at these as cognitive processes, as mental and neural connections, but they also represent themselves in behaviors. And typically, parents and teachers can actually see these changes in the behavior of their students. Not all schools, of course, do cognitive testing, but typically these are the kinds of things that parents and teachers will notice: improved focus, less frustration with difficult tasks, better ability to follow instructions. And I think you can probably connect many of these behaviors and improvements in behavior to the kinds of things and the kinds of examples that we talked about earlier. And being motivated, wanting to try harder, being better attending to detail and things like that, that are so important in our social interactions as well as our schooling. So just a few things I want to make sure we sort of emphasize and that I hope you'll be able to take away from today's webinar. First of all, that emotions can enhance or impede learning. Some of that is certainly managed by the teacher or the parent or the counselor or the therapist, and can really be enhanced and help our students and support them in their learning and their everyday functioning. Self-regulation then is something that we need to, is part of emotional intelligence, something we need to help our students develop. Not all of them are developing that as effectively as we would like. So we think about executive functions as those mental processes that enable us to regulate emotions and other cognitive processes. We know that there are issues in general for adolescents, students from low SES, students with ADD and ADHD, and probably a number of others. And then finally, the takeaway is that we can actually not just accommodate and work around these things, but we can actually train these functions. We can get these functions to the level of automaticity in our brains and our functioning, and that can have a result on a behavior. So I would be happy to answer any questions or entertain comments, have people share any more thoughts that they have at this point. And Sarah, you can let me know.
I will do that. I don't see anything coming in at the moment, but sometimes it takes a minute to type. I will take a minute while we wait. Oh, sorry.
So I was just going to say, while we're waiting, I'd just let everybody know if anybody happens to be in Boston at the end of the week, this weekend, for the Learning in the Brain Conference, I hope you'll stop by and say hello, because I'll be there.
So far, no questions. I do want to comment, because there's been a lot of hot items lately about brain training in newspapers and things, and various, yes, they work, no, they don't work. And that is something that is near and dear to our hearts for various reasons. But one thing to note in these studies that you see, it is done with a definite protocol of time and intensity that is extremely important when you consider this kind of training. If you expect the change to happen, you have to have that kind of intensity. And that's really the difference between when they work and when they don't work. In general, there's some others.
Great. Well, if I know questions sometimes come up later when you're processing and thinking about things, we certainly would welcome hearing from you and enjoy further discussions with you. We hope you've found this helpful and interesting today, and we hope you'll join us on a future webinar. Thanks so much.
Everybody have a great day.